1178 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean, a world collapsing into chaos. Across the ancient Near East, from Anatolia to the Levant, great civilizations were falling like dominoes. The mighty Hittite Empire, which had stood for centuries as one of the world's superpowers, had been swept away. The proud city of Ugarit, a prosperous trading hub on the Syrian coast, lay in smouldering ruins. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece, once gleaming centres of Bronze Age culture, had been abandoned or destroyed. The kingdom of Alasia on Cyprus had been overwhelmed. Carchemish teetered on the brink of collapse. Something terrible was moving through the world, and it was headed straight for Egypt. The cause of this catastrophe was not a single enemy army. It was something far more terrifying. A confederation of peoples driven from their homelands by forces we can only partially understand were sweeping across the Mediterranean like a tsunami of humanity. The Egyptians called them the peoples of the sea. We know them as the Sea Peoples. They came by the thousands, warriors with their families carrying everything they owned in ox-drawn carts, their children clutching their mothers as armies marched alongside. These were not raiders looking for plunder. These were displaced populations looking for a new home, and they were willing to destroy anyone who stood in their way. In the royal palace at Ramesses in the eastern Nile Delta, Pharaoh Ramesses III received reports that must have chilled even his royal blood. The Sea Peoples had already accomplished what no enemy had done in generations. They had destroyed the Hittite vassal state of Amurru on Egypt's northern border. The buffer zone that had separated Egypt from chaos was gone. Nothing stood between the invaders and the richest prize in the ancient world. The Nile Valley, with its inexhaustible grain harvests, its gold mines, its legendary wealth accumulated over 3,000 years of civilization. Egypt itself was next. But who exactly were these Sea Peoples? Even now, more than 3,000 years later, their origins remain one of history's great mysteries. The very name is modern, coined by French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero in the 19th century. The ancient Egyptians never used a single collective term. Instead, they listed specific groups. The Peliset, who would later become known as the Philistines. The Tjeka, possibly refugees from Crete or the Aegean. The Sherden, perhaps from Sardinia, though that connection is debated. The Denian, who some scholars believe might be the Danuns mentioned in Homer's epics. The Weshesh, Shekelesh and others, whose very identities remain shrouded in uncertainty. What united these diverse groups was desperation. The late 13th century BC had been a period of mounting crisis across the eastern Mediterranean. A mega-drought, possibly caused by volcanic activity in Iceland, had disrupted weather patterns across the region. Harvests failed. Cities struggled to feed their populations. Trade networks, which had bound the great Bronze Age kingdoms together in a web of interdependence, began to fracture. Internal rebellions shook established powers. Banditry increased. Small kingdoms collapsed, sending waves of refugees fleeing in search of safety and sustenance. Some of the Sea Peoples appear to have been former subjects of the very kingdoms that were collapsing. Others may have been mercenaries, warriors who had sold their services to the great powers, but now found themselves unemployed as those powers crumbled. Still others were likely farmers and craftsmen, ordinary people whose world had fallen apart, who had taken up arms simply to survive. Archaeological evidence suggests that at least some groups originated in the Aegean region, possibly including refugees from the collapsing Mycenaean civilization. Their pottery, weapons, and burial practices show similarities to Aegean cultures. But other groups may have come from Anatolia, the Levant, or even Italy. The Sea Peoples were not a unified ethnic group. They were a desperate coalition of the displaced, bound together by necessity and the hope of finding a better life somewhere, anywhere, even if they had to carve it out with swords. Their track record spoke to their capabilities. These were not primitive barbarians. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, Ramesses III's mortuary temple, show Sea Peoples warriors equipped with sophisticated bronze weapons. Long straight swords designed for thrusting rather than slashing. Bronze-tipped spears. Round shields. Some groups wore elaborate helmets. The Sherden are depicted with distinctive horned helmets. The Peliset warriors wore striking feathered headdresses and moulded body armour. These were professional fighters, and they had proven themselves in battle after battle as they swept through the eastern Mediterranean. The Egyptian intelligence network, one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, had been tracking the Sea People's progress for years. earlier in the century during the reign of Pharaoh Meremptah, grandfather to Ramesses III, some of these groups had allied with Libyan tribes to attack Egypt from the west. Meremptah had defeated them, but the Egyptians had noted their fighting qualities. Now they were returning, not as auxiliaries in someone else's army, but as a migrating nation in their own right. And this time they were coming from the north. The reports reaching Ramesses' court painted a terrifying picture. The sea peoples weren't just fielding armies. The reliefs at Medinet Habu clearly show women and children accompanying the warriors, loaded into heavy ox-drawn wagons. Entire families, entire communities on the move. This wasn't a raid that could be repelled and forgotten. This was an attempted conquest, an invasion of settlement. If the sea peoples breached Egypt's frontiers, they wouldn't plunder and leave. They would stay, carving out territories, displacing Egyptian populations, perhaps ending 3 millennia of pharaonic civilization. The stakes could not have been higher. Ramesses III was not caught unprepared. He was the second pharaoh of Egypt's 20th dynasty, ascending to the throne around 1186 BC at a time when Egypt, though still powerful, faced mounting challenges. The glory days of Ramesses II, his famous predecessor, were a century in the past. Egypt's empire in Asia had been steadily contracting. The treasury, though still wealthy by ancient standards, was not what it once had been. But Ramesses III proved to be exactly what Egypt needed, a warrior pharaoh in the mould of the great conquerors of old, determined, strategic, utterly ruthless when necessary. He had already proven himself 5 years earlier, in the 5th year of his reign, when he defeated a massive Libyan invasion that had threatened Egypt from the west. That victory, celebrated in detailed reliefs at Medinet Habu, had resulted in thousands of enemy dead and the capture of enormous numbers of livestock which bolstered Egypt's economy. But Ramesses knew that battle had been merely a prelude. The real test was coming from the north. As reports of the Sea People's destruction of Amuru reached Ramesses, the pharaoh moved with decisive speed. He had learned from his grandfather's experiences. He would not wait for the enemy to reach Egyptian soil. Instead, he would meet them at Egypt's northernmost frontier, in the region the Egyptians called Djahy or Djahy, corresponding roughly to southern Lebanon in modern geography. This was strategic brilliance. By fighting in Djahy, Ramesses could keep the war away from Egypt proper, protect the rich cities of the delta, and give himself room to maneuver. If he lost a battle in Djahy, he could fall back to prepared positions. If the battle reached the delta, there would be nowhere left to retreat. The inscription from Medinet Habu preserves Ramesses' own words, describing his preparations. I equipped my frontier in Djahy, prepared before them. The phrase is deceptively simple, but it conceals months of frantic military mobilization. The Egyptian army was not a standing force in the modern sense. It consisted of a professional corps of regular soldiers and officers, supplemented in wartime by militia levies from throughout the kingdom. Ramesses had to gather this army, organize it, equip it, and march it hundreds of miles north to the frontier. He had to stockpile supplies, arrange for logistics, ensure his forces would be fed and watered in enemy territory. He had to garrison key strongpoints, establish supply lines, prepare defensive positions. All of this while maintaining Egypt's other military commitments, because even in crisis the pharaoh's forces had to watch the Nubian frontier to the south, the Libyan frontier to the west, maintain order in the provinces, and protect the vital gold mining operations in the eastern desert. The Egyptian military machine, refined over centuries, rose to the challenge. At the heart of Ramesses' army were the chariot forces, the elite striking arm of Egyptian military power. Egyptian chariots were marvels of Bronze Age engineering. Unlike the heavy 3-man Hittite chariots that relied on shock tactics, Egyptian chariots were light, fast, and agile. Built around a wooden frame with leather body panels, they carried just 2 men, a driver and an archer. These chariots were mobile firing platforms designed for hit-and-run warfare. They could race across the battlefield at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour, loose volleys of arrows into enemy formations, and wheel away before the enemy could respond. Their horses, small by modern standards but tough and well-trained, were perhaps the most valuable military assets in the Egyptian arsenal. Each chariot crew represented an enormous investment. The chariot itself required skilled craftsmen and expensive materials. The horses needed years of training. The charioteers were members of Egypt's military aristocracy, warriors who had trained since childhood in the difficult art of shooting a bow from a moving platform while maintaining formation with hundreds of other chariots. The Egyptian army had perhaps 2,000 chariots available, organised into squadrons under experienced officers. These would form the hammer that Ramesses intended to bring down on the Sea Peoples, but chariots alone could not win battles. The bulk of the Egyptian army consisted of infantry, organised into divisions named after Egypt's great gods: the division of Amun, the division of Ra, the division of Ptah, the division of Seth. Each division theoretically contained 5,000 men, though actual strength varied. These infantrymen carried bronze-tipped spears and wore padded linen armour that provided surprising protection against cutting weapons. Many carried large rectangular shields, again made of leather-covered wood. The front ranks bristled with spears. The rear ranks included archers, whose composite bows, laminated from wood, horn and sinew, could send arrows over 300 yards with deadly accuracy. Egyptian military organisation was sophisticated. Companies, platoons, squads, each with its officers and veterans. The army could march in good order, could deploy from column into line, could execute complex manoeuvres on the battlefield. Equally important, the Egyptian command structure was professional. Officers were chosen for competence, not just noble birth. Many had spent their entire careers in military service. They knew their trade, knew how to read a battlefield, knew when to attack and when to hold position. This professional competence would prove crucial in the coming battle. Ramesses also had foreign auxiliaries. Some of the Shurden, members of the Sea Peoples themselves, had entered Egyptian service decades earlier, serving as mercenaries and elite bodyguards. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show Shurden warriors, identifiable by their horned helmets, fighting for Egypt against their own kinsmen. The Egyptians also employed Nubian warriors, fierce fighters from the south, many of them expert archers, Libyan mercenaries, Canaanite warriors. The pharaoh's army was truly international, drawing on the military manpower of Egypt's empire and client states. As this massive force assembled and began its march north, the Sea Peoples were pushing south through the Levant. They had destroyed the Hittite vassal state of Amuru. Now they moved along the coast road, the ancient highway that linked Egypt to Syria and Anatolia. Their progress was methodical. This was not a lightning raid, but a deliberate conquest. The heavy ox carts carrying families and possessions moved slowly, perhaps 10 miles a day at best. The warriors marched alongside, maintaining order, scouting ahead, foraging for supplies. The Egyptian sources speak of a massive host, though exact numbers are impossible to determine, perhaps 20,000 warriors, perhaps more. And behind them, thousands of non-combatants, women and children who would settle whatever lands the warriors conquered. The Sea People's military organisation remains mysterious, but it clearly had structure and discipline. The reliefs show warriors in formation, organised into units. They employed infantry tactics that emphasise cohesion and mutual support. Small groups of 4 men each are depicted, 3 with spears and swords, the 4th carrying only a sword, possibly an officer or standard bearer. Their long straight swords were designed for close combat, for the brutal work of hand-to-hand fighting. These were not weapons for ceremonial display. They were killing tools, and the Sea Peoples had proven their effectiveness in battle after battle as they carved their way through the eastern Mediterranean. The two forces converged on the frontier region of Djahy. Here, in the hills and valleys of southern Lebanon, where ancient cedars still grew on the mountain slopes, where Phoenician cities clung to the coast and Canaanite villages dotted the interior, the fate of Egypt would be decided. Ramesses positioned his army with care. He had the advantage of preparation, of knowing the ground, of choosing where to make his stand. The Egyptian chariots would need room to manoeuvre, flat or rolling ground where their speed and mobility could be brought to bear. The infantry needed a position they could defend, perhaps with obstacles to disrupt the enemy's advance. The archers needed clear fields of fire. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe the battle in poetic, propagandistic terms, as was Egyptian custom. But beneath the religious language and royal boasting, we can glimpse the reality of what happened. The Egyptian charioteers were warriors, and all good officers ready of hand. Their horses were quivering in their every limb, ready to crush the foreign countries under their feet. Those who reached my boundary, their seed is not. Their heart and soul are finished for ever and ever. This was not mere rhetoric. This was the pharaoh's promise of annihilation, and he had the military means to deliver it. When the battle began, it began with fire and thunder. The Egyptian chariots rolled forward in waves, hundreds of vehicles raising clouds of dust, the thunder of thousands of hooves shaking the ground. The charioteers had practiced this maneuver countless times. Attack in line, approach within bow range, loose arrows, wheel away before the enemy can respond, circle back for another pass. Hit and run, over and over, whittling down the enemy with missile fire, never giving them a chance to close, never getting trapped in a static fight where numbers might tell. The Sea People's warriors would have been disciplined, would have held formation, would have raised their shields against the arrow storm. But discipline can only do so much when hundreds of bronze-tipped arrows are falling on you. Men screamed and fell. The ox carts carrying families became targets. Panic spread among the non-combatants. The Egyptian tactic was to break the enemy's cohesion, to turn an organised army into a mob and then destroy that mob with infantry charges. The Sea Peoples tried to advance, to close with the Egyptians, to bring their superior close combat weapons into play. But the chariots gave them no chance. Egyptian commanders, veterans of decades of warfare, had seen every enemy tactic. They knew how to use their mobility, knew how to refuse engagement when the enemy wanted to fight, and force engagement when the enemy wanted to withdraw. The Sea People's infantry, formidable in close combat, found themselves unable to reach their tormentors. And all the while, the Egyptian archers, both mounted and on foot, poured arrows into the densely packed enemy formations. Then came the infantry assault. When the Sea People's formation had been sufficiently disrupted, when casualties had mounted and morale had begun to crack, the Egyptian infantry advanced. Thousands of spearmen moving in organised ranks, shields locked, spear points projecting forward like the quills of a gigantic hedgehog. Behind them came more archers, continuing to shoot over the heads of their advancing comrades. The Sea People's warriors, brave and determined, met this assault with desperate courage. The fighting became brutal, hand to hand, sword against spear, shield against shield. This was where the Sea People's long swords should have given them an advantage. In close combat, the reach and cutting power of those weapons were formidable. But the Egyptians had numbers, organisation, and momentum. More critically, they had professional leadership. Egyptian officers directed their men, reinforced weak points, exploited openings. The Sea Peoples, for all their courage and desperation, lacked this level of command and control. Units became separated, gaps opened in their line, and into those gaps poured more Egyptian infantry, attacking, from the flanks, surrounding isolated groups, cutting them down. The battle became a slaughter. The inscriptions describe it in the stark language of military reports beneath the religious propaganda. Those who reached my boundary, their seed is not. The Egyptians showed no mercy. This was existential warfare. The enemy had come to conquer Egypt, to take Egyptian lands, to end Egyptian civilization. The response had to be total. Sea People's warriors were killed where they stood. Those who tried to flee were run down by chariots. Prisoners were taken, but not many. This battle was about sending a message. You cannot defeat Egypt. You cannot even survive challenging Egypt. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of Sea People's warriors died in the fighting. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, with their artistic conventions and propaganda purposes, nevertheless give us a glimpse of the carnage. Piles of bodies, prisoners with their arms bound, being marched away under guard, scribes counting severed hands, the grisly Egyptian method of tallying enemy dead. The families who had accompanied the warriors, the women and children in the ox carts, faced an uncertain fate. Some may have been killed in the fighting, others would have been captured and enslaved, absorbed into Egypt's economy as servants and labourers. The ancient world was brutal, and defeated enemies could expect little mercy. But Ramesses understood something crucial. Defeating the Sea Peoples on land was only half the battle. These were seafaring peoples. They had ships, navies, the ability to bypass land defences and strike directly at Egypt from the sea. Even as his army was destroying the Sea People's land forces in Djahy, Ramesses received intelligence that a naval force, a fleet of Sea People's warships, was approaching the Nile Delta from the Mediterranean. This was the second prong of the invasion, and it had to be stopped. Ramesses had anticipated this. Even as he prepared for the land battle, he had mobilized Egypt's naval forces. Egyptian warships, galleys powered by oars and sails, assembled at the mouths of the Nile. The pharaoh's strategy here was as brilliant as his land tactics had been. He would not try to fight the sea peoples on the open Mediterranean, where their superior seamanship might give them an advantage. Instead, he would lure them into the narrow channels of the Nile Delta, into waters the Egyptians knew intimately, where maneuverability would be restricted and Egyptian numbers could be brought to bear. The Battle of the Delta, as it became known, would complete the destruction of the Sea People's invasion. But it was the Battle of Djahy that broke their military power, that shattered their army, that ended any hope they had of conquering Egypt by force. The land battle was decisive. After Djahy, the Sea Peoples could raid, could harass, could settle in territories Egypt did not control, but they could never again threaten Egypt's existence. The aftermath of the battle revealed the price of victory. The Egyptian army had won a crushing triumph, but it had not come cheap. Casualties, though certainly lighter than the enemy's, had still been significant. Equipment had been expended, supplies consumed. More critically, the campaign had drained enormous resources from the treasury. Moving an army hundreds of miles, fighting a major battle, maintaining forces in the field for months, all of this cost money. Gold, grain, manufactured goods, all flowing out of the royal coffers to pay for the defence of the realm. The prisoners taken at Djahy presented both an opportunity and a challenge. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show thousands of captured Sea People's warriors, bound and defeated, being paraded before the gods and the pharaoh. Some were executed as examples, others were enslaved. Interestingly, many were actually incorporated into the Egyptian military. The Egyptians were pragmatic. These were skilled warriors. Why not use them? Ramesses settled groups of defeated Sea Peoples in frontier garrisons, where they served as military colonists, defending Egypt's borders in exchange for land and status. The Peliset, the Philistines, would eventually be settled by Egypt in southern Canaan, in what would become Palestine, as a buffer against other threats. But the true cost of the war went deeper. The Battle of Djahy and the subsequent Battle of the Delta, while successful in saving Egypt, marked the beginning of the end for Egyptian imperial power. The resources expended were never fully recovered. Within a few years, Ramesses would face another major invasion, this time by Libyans in his 11th year. That battle too would be won, but at further cost. The Egyptian treasury was being systematically drained. The strain showed in unexpected ways. In the 29th year of Ramesses' reign, the workers building royal tombs at Deir el-Medina, the village of the royal necropolis workers, went on strike. They hadn't been paid. The royal treasury, once seemingly inexhaustible, could not meet its obligations. This was the first recorded labour strike in human history, and it was a symptom of Egypt's declining power. The Bronze Age world that Ramesses had fought to preserve was dying. The Sea Peoples, though defeated by Egypt, were a symptom of a much larger collapse. The great kingdoms and empires that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries were gone or fatally weakened. The intricate trade networks that had bound them together were shattered. Technologies were lost. Literacy declined in many regions. The ancient world entered what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse, a dark age that would last for generations. Egypt survived, but it would never again reach the heights of power it had enjoyed under pharaohs like Thutmose III or Ramesses II. The empire in Asia, which had once extended deep into Syria, contracted back toward the Nile. Within a century, Egypt would lose control of Nubia. To the south, its source of gold and many luxury goods. The New Kingdom, the period of Egypt's greatest imperial power, was ending. The third intermediate period that followed would see Egypt divided, weakened, eventually conquered by foreign powers. But in 1178 BC, standing on the battlefield of Djahy, surveying the destruction of the Sea People's army, Ramesses III could claim to have saved Egyptian civilization. The threat that had destroyed the Hittites, that had burned cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean, that had ended kingdoms and displaced entire populations, had been stopped at Egypt's gates. The pharaoh's chariots, his disciplined infantry, his professional officers had proven equal to the challenge. Egypt endured. The Battle of Djahy was immortalized at Medinet Habu, Ramesses' mortuary temple on the west bank at Thebes, modern Luxor. The temple, begun early in his reign, was expanded and enhanced throughout his nearly 40-year rule. It remains one of the best preserved temples from ancient Egypt, and its walls tell the story of Ramesses' wars in unprecedented detail. The reliefs showing the battles against the Sea Peoples are among the most famous images from ancient Egypt. They are also among our most important historical sources for understanding the Bronze Age collapse. These relief carvings are extraordinary for their detail and their artistic quality. They show us what the Sea Peoples looked like, how they dressed, what weapons they carried. We can identify different groups by their distinctive headgear and equipment. The Shurden with their horned helmets, the Peliset with their feathered headdresses and distinctive kilts, the Chika, the Denian, each with their own visual markers. We see the ox carts carrying women and children, stark evidence that this was no mere raid but an attempted migration. We see Egyptian chariots charging into battle, infantrymen engaging in hand-to-hand combat, prisoners being taken, scribes counting severed hands, the pharaoh presenting captives to the gods. The inscriptions accompanying these reliefs are equally valuable. They give us dates, names, details of the campaign. They preserve Ramesses' own account of the battles, filtered through the conventions of royal propaganda, but nonetheless containing genuine historical information. The inscription describing the Battle of Djahy states, "I equipped my frontier in Djahy, prepared before them. The chiefs, the captains of infantry, the nobles, I caused to equip the river mouths like a strong wall, with warships, galleys, and barges. They were manned completely from bow to stern with valiant warriors bearing their arms, soldiers of all the choicest of Egypt, being like lions roaring upon the mountain tops. The charioteers were warriors, and all good officers, ready of hand. Their horses were quivering in their every limb, ready to crush the countries under their feet." This is propaganda, certainly, glorifying the pharaoh and Egypt's military might. But it is propaganda rooted in real events. Ramesses did equip his frontier. He did deploy his forces strategically. He did win the battle. The relief sculptures and inscriptions at Medinet Habu are not objective historical records, but they are evidence, primary sources created within years of the events they describe. Modern historians use them carefully, cross-referencing them with archaeological evidence, with accounts from other sources, with our understanding of Bronze Age warfare and society. But they remain our best window into the Sea Peoples crisis and Egypt's response to it. The Battle of Djahy demonstrates several important aspects of ancient warfare. First, the crucial importance of military professionalism. The Egyptian army was well organised, well trained, and well led. Its officers knew their business. Its tactics were sound. Its logistical support was adequate to the task. The Sea Peoples warriors were brave and individually skilled, but they lacked the institutional knowledge, the organisational sophistication, the command structure that the Egyptians possessed. In ancient warfare, these factors often decided battles as much as raw courage or numerical superiority. Second, the battle shows the importance of strategic preparation and defensive depth. Ramesses did not wait for the enemy to reach Egypt. He met them at the frontier, on ground of his choosing, with prepared positions and supply lines established. This gave him enormous advantages. He could concentrate his forces. He could choose where and when to fight. He could withdraw if necessary and fight again from stronger positions. The Sea Peoples, advancing into hostile territory, lacked these advantages. They were forced to fight when and where the Egyptians chose, and that proved fatal. Third, the battle demonstrates the combined arms tactics that characterize Bronze Age warfare at its most sophisticated. The Egyptians used chariots, infantry, and archers in coordinated fashion. Each component supported the others. The chariots provided mobility and missile power, disrupting enemy formations and preventing the enemy from closing. The infantry provided staying power, the ability to hold ground and engage in sustained combat. The archers provided firepower throughout the battle, inflicting casualties and suppressing enemy movement. No single arm could have won the battle alone. Together, they were overwhelming. The personal role of Ramesses himself in the battle is difficult to assess. Egyptian royal ideology required the pharaoh to be depicted as the supreme warrior, personally dominating the battlefield. The reliefs show Ramesses in his chariot, larger than life, shooting arrows into enemy ranks, trampling foes beneath his horse's hooves. This is convention, symbolic representation of the pharaoh's power rather than documentary record. But it would be wrong to assume Ramesses was merely a figurehead. Egyptian pharaohs of the New Kingdom were expected to be military leaders. They trained in warfare from childhood. Many personally commanded armies in the field. Ramesses had already proven himself in battle against the Libyans. He understood warfare, understood strategy. Whether he personally fought at Djahy is less important than recognizing that he planned the campaign, organized the forces, made the strategic decisions that led to victory. The fate of the Sea Peoples after Djahy is a matter of some historical debate. We know from Egyptian sources that Ramesses settled some of the captured Sea Peoples in garrison towns, using them as military colonists. The Peliset were settled in southern Canaan, in the coastal region that would become known as Philistia, Palestine. They established city-states at places like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza. These Philistine cities would become prominent in the biblical period, frequently clashing with the Israelites. The archaeological record shows that the Philistines brought with them distinctive pottery styles and architectural features that suggest Aegean origins, supporting the connection between the Peliset and the Sea Peoples who attacked Egypt. Other groups among the Sea Peoples dispersed throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Cheka appear to have settled along the coast of Phoenicia. The Sherdan, despite their service in the Egyptian army, may have eventually migrated westward, possibly to Sardinia, though this connection remains speculative. What is clear is that after 1177 BC, after their defeat at Egyptian hands, the Sea Peoples ceased to exist as a unified threat. They fragmented, settling in various locations, adapting to local conditions, gradually being absorbed into the populations around them. The Battle of Djahy thus marks a turning point not just in Egyptian history, but in the history of the eastern Mediterranean. It was the moment when the wave of destruction that had swept away the Bronze Age kingdoms finally broke against a power strong enough to resist it. Egypt bent under the strain but didn't break. The price was high, but Egyptian civilization survived, preserving its culture, its institutions, its distinctive identity for another 1,000 years and more. The battle also raises profound questions about the nature of historical change. The collapse of the Bronze Age kingdoms was not caused solely by the Sea Peoples. Modern scholars recognize that the invasions were as much a symptom as a cause. Climate change, possibly triggered by volcanic activity, disrupted agriculture across the eastern Mediterranean. Droughts led to famines. Famines led to migrations. Migrations led to conflicts over resources. Trade networks collapsed, depriving kingdoms of vital raw materials. Internal rebellions weakened central authorities. The complex, interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age proved fragile when faced with multiple simultaneous crises. The Sea Peoples were refugees from this collapse, driven from their homelands, searching desperately for new lands to settle. That made them dangerous not because they were inherently warlike or barbaric, but because they were desperate. Desperate people fight with a ferocity that secure, comfortable people cannot match. They have nothing left to lose. When the Sea Peoples attacked Egypt, they were fighting for survival, for the chance to find a home, for their children's futures. This does not excuse the destruction they caused, the cities they burned, the lives they took, but it helps us understand them as human beings caught in catastrophic circumstances rather than as mindless destroyers. Ramesses III, for his part, was doing exactly what a responsible ruler should do. He was defending his people, protecting Egyptian civilization from an existential threat. He prepared carefully, fought decisively, and won. That his victory had long-term costs, that it contributed to Egypt's eventual decline, does not diminish his achievement. He played the hand history dealt him as well as anyone could have. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse when so many other powers did not, and much of the credit belongs to Ramesses and the army that fought at Djahy. The battle's legacy extends beyond its immediate historical importance. It became a foundational moment in Egyptian historical memory, a proof that Egypt could face down any threat, that the pharaoh's power was divinely ordained and irresistible. The reliefs at Medinet Habu ensured that the story would be told and retold for generations. Egyptian scribes copied the texts. Priests recited the tales of Ramesses' victories. The battle became part of Egyptian national mythology, a source of pride and inspiration. For modern historians, the Battle of Djahy and the Sea Peoples' invasions represent a crucial case study in how civilizations respond to existential crises. Egypt's response combined military strength, strategic intelligence, flexible tactics, and institutional resilience. The same qualities that had allowed Egypt to endure for millennia served it well in this crisis. But the cost of survival, the resources expended, The damage to trade and economy accumulated over time. Even successful defense against catastrophic threats can leave lasting scars. The archaeological evidence supports and complements the Egyptian textual sources. Excavations throughout the Levant show massive destructions dating to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Cities that had flourished for centuries were abandoned or drastically reduced in size. Trade goods from this period show sharp declines in both quantity and quality. The Bronze Age international trade in tin, copper and luxury goods largely ceased. This widespread destruction and disruption forms the backdrop to the Sea People's invasions and the Battle of Djahy. In Egypt itself, the archaeological record shows both continuity and change. Unlike the kingdoms to the north, Egyptian cities and temples were not destroyed. The bureaucratic system continued functioning. Hieroglyphic writing continued to be used and taught. Religious institutions maintained their practices, but there are signs of strain. Building projects became less ambitious. The quality of craftwork declined in some areas. Inflation appears in the records. These are the marks of a society under stress, maintaining its core functions but unable to achieve the glory of earlier periods. The reign of Ramesses III represents the last gasp of New Kingdom power. He was the last pharaoh to campaign successfully beyond Egypt's borders, the last to build on the monumental scale of his predecessors, the last to embody the ideal of the pharaoh as warrior king. After his death, Egypt entered a long period of decline. The empire contracted, royal power weakened. Eventually, Egypt fragmented into competing kingdoms. Foreign dynasties would come to rule the ancient land. But in 1178 BC, for one crucial moment, Egyptian power held firm. The Sea Peoples crashed against the Egyptian military machine and broke. Standing in Medinet Habu today, 3,000 years after the battle, visitors can still see the dramatic reliefs depicting Ramesses' victories. The colours have faded, worn away by time and weather. The details are sometimes hard to make out, but the essential story remains clear. Here is the pharaoh in his chariot, larger than life, symbol of divine power. Here are the Egyptian soldiers, disciplined and organised. Here are the Sea People's warriors, brave but doomed. Here are the captives, bound and defeated. Here are the scribes, counting the dead. Here is victory, purchased at terrible price but victory nonetheless. The Battle of Djahy saved Egyptian civilization. It halted an invasion that had already destroyed kingdoms throughout the eastern Mediterranean. It demonstrated that even in an age of collapse, even when the world itself seemed to be ending, courage, skill and determination could still turn the tide. The Sea Peoples came seeking a new home, willing to destroy Egypt to achieve it. They found instead that Egypt, though past its peak, was still strong enough to defend itself. The bronze weapons they carried, the sophisticated tactics they employed, the desperation that drove them, none of it was enough. Egyptian chariots swept across the battlefield. Egyptian infantry held the line. Egyptian archers filled the air with bronze-tipped death. And when the sun set over Djahy, the Sea People's invasion was broken. Ramesses III had won his greatest victory. Egypt had survived its greatest challenge in generations. The price was high, perhaps too high. Egypt would never fully recover the power and glory it had once possessed. But it survived. In an age when survival itself was an achievement, when kingdoms fell and civilizations crumbled, that was enough. The thunder of Egyptian chariots had spoken at Djahy, and the Sea Peoples had learned that some walls could not be breached, some kingdoms could not be conquered. Egypt endured. The psychological impact of the victory rippled through the ancient world. Word of the Sea People's defeat spread along the remaining trade routes, carried by merchants and diplomats who still maintained contact between the surviving kingdoms. For the smaller states of the Levant, kingdoms like Byblos and Sidon that had managed to survive the chaos by submission and diplomacy, the news offered a glimmer of hope. Egypt, the ancient superpower, still had teeth. The invaders who had seemed unstoppable had been stopped. Perhaps the world was not ending after all. Perhaps some semblance of order could be maintained. But the victory at Djahy also revealed uncomfortable truths about the new world emerging from the Bronze Age collapse. Egypt had won, but barely. The resources marshalled for the campaign, the losses sustained, the ongoing costs of maintaining military readiness against future threats, all of this strained even Egypt's legendary wealth. Ramesses had proven that Egypt could defend itself. but he had also demonstrated the limits of Egyptian power. There would be no campaigns of conquest into Syria, no expeditions to reassert control over distant territories. Egypt's empire, which had once stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates, was now essentially limited to the Nile Valley and its immediate surroundings. The naval battle that followed Djahy, fought in the waterways of the Nile Delta, completed the destruction of the Sea People's invasion force. The relief sculptures at Medinet Habu depicting this engagement are among the most detailed representations of ancient naval warfare that survive. They show Egyptian ships, galleys with high prows and sterns, engaging Sea People's vessels in close combat. Egyptian archers stand on deck, pouring arrows into enemy ships at point-blank range. Grappling hooks pull ships together, marines board enemy vessels. The fighting is brutal, hand-to-hand, decided by courage and numbers rather than sophisticated naval tactics. The Egyptians held every advantage in this engagement. They knew the waters intimately. They had positioned shore-based archers at strategic points along the channels. They had ships in reserve, fresh crews waiting to enter the battle. The Sea Peoples, exhausted from their journey, battered by the defeat at Djahy, depleted of supplies, sailed into a trap. Egyptian warships blocked the channels ahead and behind. Arrows rained down from both ships and shore. The Sea Peoples fought desperately, their seamanship and courage evident even in defeat, but the outcome was never in doubt. The naval battle ended with the destruction or capture of virtually the entire Sea People's fleet. Hundreds of enemy ships were sunk or burned. Thousands more warriors died in the fighting or drowned in the Nile. The survivors, pulled from the water or surrendered from damaged ships, faced the same fate as their comrades captured at Djahy. Execution, enslavement, or incorporation into Egyptian forces as military colonists. The relief inscriptions described the Egyptian victory in terms of divine favour. The gods had delivered Egypt's enemies into the pharaoh's hands. The religious interpretation served important political purposes, reinforcing Ramesses' legitimacy and divine mandate. But beneath the theological language lay military reality. Superior preparation, better knowledge of terrain, effective command and control, these had won the battle. The double victory, on land at Djahy and at sea in the Delta, effectively ended the Sea Peoples as a unified threat to Egypt. But it did not end Egypt's problems. The Libyan threat remained. Bedouin tribes pressed on Egypt's eastern frontier. Pirates and raiders operated in the Mediterranean. Egypt's sphere of influence, once extending across much of the eastern Mediterranean, had contracted dramatically. The tribute and trade goods that had once flowed into Thebes and Memphis from subject territories now came in reduced quantities, or not at all. The gold mines of Nubia, Egypt's economic foundation, required constant military presence to protect and operate. Every garrison, every frontier fort, every patrol required men, supplies, money. The cost never stopped, but the revenues to pay them were declining. Ramesses' response to these challenges showed his strategic understanding. He could not reconquer Egypt's lost empire. He lacked the resources, and the international situation made such expansion impossible. Instead, he focused on defense, on maintaining Egypt's core territories, on preserving what could be preserved. He built or rebuilt fortresses along Egypt's frontiers. He maintained the army at high readiness, conducting regular training exercises. He rotated units between garrison duty and campaign deployment, ensuring that soldiers remained experienced and cohesive. These measures were expensive, but they worked. For the remaining 3 decades of his reign, Egypt faced no existential threats comparable to the Sea People's invasion. The pharaoh also worked to stabilize Egypt's economy, recognizing that military power ultimately rested on economic foundations. He sponsored temple-building projects that provided employment for craftsmen and laborers. He maintained Egypt's irrigation systems, ensuring agricultural productivity. He regulated trade, protecting Egyptian merchants while extracting revenues through customs and taxes. The Great Inscription at Medinet Habu lists his donations to temples throughout Egypt, massive quantities of gold, silver, copper, grain, livestock, land. These donations served multiple purposes. They fulfilled the pharaoh's religious obligations, maintaining the favor of the gods. They provided economic stimulus, as temples employed thousands of workers, and they reinforced the political alliance between the monarchy and the priesthood, crucial for maintaining social stability. But cracks were appearing in the system. The strike at Deir el-Medina in year 29 of Ramesses' reign, though resolved relatively quickly, pointed to deeper problems. The royal necropolis workers, skilled craftsmen who built and decorated the tombs of pharaohs and nobles, were elite labourers with special status. If they were not being paid on time, if the administration could not meet its obligations to them, what did that say about the government's ability to pay soldiers, maintain infrastructure, fund temple operations? The strike was a warning sign, an indication that Egypt's economic difficulties were becoming acute. Inflation appears in the records from this period. Grain prices, the standard measure of value in ancient Egypt, rose significantly. Copper, another monetary standard, became more expensive. These price increases suggest currency debasement or supply shortages, or both. The reliable functioning of Egypt's economy, which had persisted for millennia, was becoming unreliable. Workers could not count on regular payment. Merchants could not be certain of stable prices. The predictability that had been a hallmark of Egyptian civilization was eroding. The religious and ideological response to these challenges is visible in the architecture and art of Ramesses' reign. Medinet Habu is not just a mortuary temple. It is a statement, a declaration of power and permanence in an uncertain age. The massive walls, the elaborate decorations, the detailed battle scenes, all of this serves to proclaim that Egypt remains strong, that the pharaoh retains divine favour, that order persists despite chaos in the world beyond Egypt's borders. The temple's sheer scale is impressive. The first pylon, the monumental gateway, stands over 60 feet high. The walls enclose an area of nearly 75,000 square metres. The reliefs and inscriptions cover vast expanses of stone, thousands upon thousands of hieroglyphs and images. This architectural propaganda was necessary because the reality was more complicated. Egypt had survived, but it had changed. The supreme confidence of earlier periods, the assumption that Egypt was the centre of a stable world order, that confidence had been shaken. The reliefs at Medinet Habu showing the defeat of the Sea Peoples were not just historical records. They were reassurance, proof that Egypt could still defend itself, that the old ways still worked, that the gods still favoured their chosen land. Every visitor to the temple, every priest conducting rituals, every official walking through the courtyards would see those images and be reminded. Egypt endures, the enemies are defeated, order prevails over chaos. The cult of Ramesses III, the religious veneration of the pharaoh as a god, intensified during and after the Sea Peoples crisis. This was standard practice in Egyptian religion. Successful pharaohs, especially warrior kings who defended Egypt, were often deified after death and sometimes during life. But the emphasis placed on Ramesses' divine status, the scale of his mortuary cult suggests something more. A society under stress, facing an uncertain future, was clinging to the symbols and rituals that had always provided stability. If the pharaoh was a god, if his victories proved divine favour, then Egypt must be secure, must be protected, must endure. The treatment of captured sea peoples reveals the complexity of Egyptian attitudes toward foreigners. Egyptian ideology divided the world into Egypt and chaos. Foreigners were inherently inferior, agents of disorder who threatened Maat, the divine order that Egypt embodied. The relief shows sea peoples in dehumanizing ways, bound and helpless, trampled under Egyptian feet, presented as offerings to the gods. This iconography served political purposes, reinforcing Egyptian superiority and the pharaoh's role as defender of civilization against barbarism. Yet Egyptian practice was more nuanced than ideology suggested. The Egyptians had long employed foreign mercenaries. Nubians, Libyans, Canaanites, even earlier groups of sea peoples like the Shurden had served in Egyptian forces for generations. These foreigners could rise to positions of prominence in the army. They received land grants, married into Egyptian society, adopted Egyptian culture. Egypt's strength had always derived partly from its ability to absorb and utilize foreign peoples. The sea peoples captured at Djahy followed this pattern. After the initial violence of conquest, after the executions and enslavement of some, many prisoners were integrated into Egyptian society. They became soldiers, farmers, craftsmen. Their children would be Egyptian, speaking Egyptian, worshipping Egyptian gods, serving Egyptian pharaohs. This absorption of the sea peoples represents one of ancient history's great ironies. The invaders who sought to conquer Egypt were instead conquered by Egyptian culture. The Peliset settled in southern Canaan, in the cities of Philistia, retained some of their distinctive culture for generations. Their pottery remained distinct. Their gods, while eventually syncretized with Canaanite deities, maintained separate identities, but they became part of the regional culture, participants in the Levantine world rather than conquerors seeking to overthrow it. Other groups among the Sea Peoples disappeared entirely into local populations, leaving only traces in archaeological records and scattered references in texts. The question of what drove the Sea Peoples from their homelands remains one of archaeology's enduring mysteries. The megadrought hypothesis, supported by paleoclimate studies showing significantly reduced rainfall across the eastern Mediterranean in the late 13th century BC, provides one explanation. Years of poor harvests would have created food shortages, economic disruption, social instability. Populations facing starvation migrate or die. Those with the means to move, with ships and weapons and organisation, would have sought better lands. The eastern Mediterranean coast, with its fertile valleys and established cities, would have been an obvious target. But climate alone cannot explain the collapse. The Hittite Empire did not fall solely because of drought. Internal political problems, succession crises, revolts in subject territories all contributed to its weakness. When the final blow came, whether from Sea Peoples' invasions or internal collapse or both, the empire was already fatally compromised. Similarly, the Mycenaean kingdoms in Greece appear to have been declining for decades before the final destructions. Palace administration became less efficient. Trade declined. Defences were strengthened, suggesting increasing insecurity. The system was failing before external enemies delivered the coup de grace. Earthquake storms, sequences of major earthquakes striking a region over short periods, may have contributed to the collapse. The eastern Mediterranean lies along major tectonic fault lines. Modern seismological studies have documented devastating earthquake sequences in ancient times. If multiple major cities suffered earthquake damage within a few years, the disruption to trade, to agriculture, to administration would have been catastrophic. Damaged cities would be vulnerable to attack. Refugee populations fleeing destroyed regions would place impossible strains on intact areas. The cascading failures could bring down the entire interconnected system. What seems clear is that the Bronze Age collapse was not caused by a single factor. Multiple stresses combined to overwhelm the resilience of Bronze Age societies. Climate change, earthquakes, internal political problems, economic disruption, and military invasions reinforced each other. Each crisis made societies less able to cope with the next crisis. The complex, interdependent world of the Late Bronze Age proved fragile when subjected to sustained stress. Egypt survived partly because it was less dependent on international trade than the other powers. The Nile Valley was largely self-sufficient. Egypt could feed itself from its own agriculture. It had its own sources of gold, copper, stone. When trade networks collapsed, Egypt suffered economically but did not collapse internally. The army that fought at Djahy represented centuries of Egyptian military development. The tactics, the organisation, the equipment, all had been refined through generations of warfare. Egyptian military manuals, preserved in hieratic script, show sophisticated thinking about logistics, strategy, and tactics. Officers studied previous campaigns. They understood terrain, weather, supply lines. The Egyptian army was not an improvised force. It was an institution, one of the most professional military organizations in the ancient world. This institutional knowledge gave Egypt a decisive advantage over the Sea Peoples, who, despite their courage and skill, lacked comparable organizational sophistication. The chariots that dominated the Battle of Djahy were themselves products of centuries of development. The earliest Egyptian chariots, introduced during the Second Intermediate Period, when the Hyksos rulers brought the technology to Egypt, were heavier and less maneuverable. By Ramesses III's time, Egyptian chariot design had been perfected. The vehicles were lightweight, perhaps 70 pounds for the chariot body, pulled by 2 horses. The wheels, 4 or 6 spokes each, were precisely balanced. The axle position was calculated to optimize handling. The result was a vehicle that could turn sharply, accelerate quickly, and maintain high speeds across rough terrain. The horses themselves represented enormous investments. Breeding programs produced animals suited to Egyptian conditions and military needs. Training began when horses were young and continued for years. a fully trained chariot horse was worth more than a peasant family could earn in a lifetime. Losing horses in battle was a serious economic loss, one reason Egyptian commanders preferred standoff tactics using archery, rather than close combat that might result in horses being killed or injured. The composite bow used by Egyptian archers was another technological marvel. Unlike simple bows made from a single piece of wood, composite bows laminated together wood, horn, and sinew. The horn, on the belly of the bow, facing the archer, resisted compression. The sinew, on the back of the bow, resisted tension. The wood provided structure. The result was a bow that could store enormous energy despite its relatively small size. Egyptian composite bows could achieve draw weights over 100 pounds and launch arrows over 300 yards. In skilled hands, they were devastatingly accurate at combat ranges of 50 to 100 yards. The arrows themselves were carefully manufactured. The shafts, typically made from reed, were selected for straightness and consistency. The bronze arrowheads were cast using lost wax techniques, producing precise aerodynamic shapes. The fletching, usually 3 feathers, stabilized the arrow in flight. Each component had to meet exacting standards. Poorly made arrows would not fly straight, would not penetrate armor, would not perform in combat. Egyptian arsenals maintained quality control, inspecting weapons and ammunition, rejecting substandard items. This attention to detail, this emphasis on quality, gave Egyptian forces consistent advantages. The infantry spearmen who formed the backbone of Egyptian battle lines carried weapons that had changed little in centuries because they worked. The spear with its bronze tip on a wooden shaft was simple, effective, and relatively cheap to produce. A spearman required less training than an archer or charioteer. With a few months of practice, a peasant conscript could learn to hold formation, to keep his shield up, to thrust his spear at enemies. These qualities made infantry the foundation of ancient armies. They could not win battles alone, but without them, victories were impossible. Egyptian military logistics were sophisticated for the ancient world. Supply depots maintained stocks of grain, beer, dried fish, and other provisions. Quartermasters calculated consumption rates and organized supply trains. Medical personnel, including physicians trained in trauma care, accompanied armies to treat wounded soldiers. Veterinarians cared for horses and oxen. Scribes maintained records of personnel, equipment, and supplies. This administrative infrastructure allowed Egyptian armies to campaign far from home for extended periods. The sea peoples, lacking comparable logistics, were at a severe disadvantage operating in hostile territory. The intelligence network that warned Ramesses of the sea people's approach included spies, scouts, and diplomatic reports. Egypt maintained diplomatic relations with kingdoms throughout the region. These relationships provided information about political developments, military movements, and emerging threats. When the Sea Peoples destroyed Amuru, Egyptian officials in the region would have sent urgent reports. When refugees fleeing the invasion reached Egyptian territory, they would have been questioned. When merchant ships arrived in Egyptian ports with news of destruction in the north, that information would have been forwarded to the capital. This intelligence gave Ramesses time to prepare, time to mobilize forces, time to position his army at Djahy rather than being caught by surprise. The diplomatic aftermath of Djahy saw Egypt reasserting influence where possible, but accepting reduced reach where necessary. The pharaoh maintained relations with surviving Levantine city-states, offering protection in exchange for tribute and loyalty. But the old empire was gone. Egypt no longer controlled a network of vassal states extending into Syria. The buffer zones that had once separated Egypt from potential enemies had been largely eliminated. Egypt's frontier now lay closer to home, requiring constant vigilance and military presence. The settlement of captured sea peoples in frontier garrisons created a new social category in Egyptian society. These military colonists were neither fully Egyptian nor entirely foreign. They maintained some of their distinctive culture while adopting Egyptian language and customs. Their children faced complex questions of identity. Were they sea peoples? Were they Egyptian? The answer was probably both and neither. This hybridity, this blending of cultures, would become increasingly common in the Eastern Mediterranean as the region emerged from the Bronze Age collapse into the Iron Age. The weapons recovered from sea people's graves and depicted in Egyptian reliefs show sophisticated metallurgy. The long swords, some over 30 inches in length, required skilled smiths to produce. Bronze casting is technically challenging. The alloy must be correctly proportioned, typically about 90% copper and 10% tin. The temperature must be precisely controlled. The moulds must be carefully designed to prevent defects. These swords were not crude weapons hammered out by amateurs. They were precision tools made by master craftsmen, evidence that the Sea Peoples, whatever their origins, had access to advanced metallurgical technology. The round shields carried by Sea Peoples warriors, visible in the Medinet Habu reliefs, were likely made of bronze or leather-covered wood with bronze reinforcements. These shields were smaller and more maneuverable than the large rectangular shields favoured by Egyptian infantry. The choice reflected different tactical doctrines. Egyptian infantry fought in massed formations where large shields could lock together, creating a wall. Sea Peoples warriors appear to have fought in more open order, where individual skill and mobility mattered more than formation coherence. Neither system was inherently superior. Each worked within its tactical context. At Djahy, Egyptian tactics prevailed because the Egyptians had superiority in numbers, organisation, and combined arms coordination. The feathered headdresses worn by Peliset warriors, prominently displayed in the Medinet Habu reliefs, have generated much scholarly discussion. Some researchers see them as evidence of Aegean origin, possibly connected to similar headdresses worn by warriors in Mycenaean art. Others suggest they may be artistic convention, or symbolic rather than literal representations. Whatever their origin, these headdresses became iconic, the visual marker that identified Peliset warriors in Egyptian art. When later Egyptian sources depicted Philistines, the descendants of the Peliset who settled in southern Canaan, they often showed them wearing similar feathered headdresses, maintaining the iconographic tradition established at Medinet Habu. The ox carts carrying Sea Peoples families, shown in several relief panels at Medinet Habu, provide poignant evidence of the human dimension of the crisis. These were not warriors seeking glory or plunder. These were refugees fleeing disaster, families hoping to find safety and a future somewhere. The carts carried children, elderly people, household goods, everything the migrants owned. That they brought their families into a war zone speaks to their desperation. They had nowhere else to go. Egypt was their last hope, and they were willing to fight for the chance to settle there. Their defeat meant the end of that hope, death or enslavement or uncertain futures as military colonists in service to the power that had destroyed their dreams. The religious dimension of the Sea Peoples crisis appears in Egyptian sources. Ramesses presented his victories as proof of divine favour, as the gods of Egypt defending their land against foreign chaos. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu invoke Amun-Ra, king of the gods, Ptah, creator and craftsman, and other deities as sources of Egyptian strength. The pharaoh himself was considered a god incarnate, the living Horus, son of Ra. His victories were not merely military achievements but religious events, demonstrations that cosmic order, Ma'at, prevailed over chaos, Isfet. This religious interpretation was not mere propaganda. Ancient Egyptians genuinely understood warfare in religious terms. To fight for Egypt was to fight for the gods, to defend sacred order against profane disorder. The Sea Peoples presumably had their own gods, their own religious understandings of their situation. The archaeological and textual evidence provides frustratingly little information about Sea Peoples' religion. Some groups may have worshipped Aegean deities, gods and goddesses from the Greek or Anatolian pantheons. Others may have had Levantine religious affiliations. When the Peliset settled in Philistia, they adopted or brought with them gods like Dagon, a deity associated with grain or the sea, and Baal-zebub, another Levantine god. Whether these represented continuity with Sea Peoples' religion or adaptation to their new environment remains unclear. The impact of Djahy on Egyptian military thinking appears in later sources. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms tactics and defensive strategy. Subsequent Egyptian military operations, though smaller in scale, followed similar patterns. Use chariots for mobility and firepower, use infantry for staying power, use archers for continuous harassment, choose when and where to fight, force the enemy to engage on unfavourable terms. These principles, proven at Djahy, became standard doctrine. They would remain relevant for centuries, long after the specific circumstances that produced them had changed. The literacy and record-keeping that preserved the account of Djahy were themselves sources of Egyptian strength. The scribal bureaucracy, trained in hieroglyphic and hieratic writing, maintained continuity of administration. Records were kept, copied, stored, consulted. Knowledge accumulated and was passed down through generations. This institutional memory gave Egypt advantages other societies lacked. Egyptian officials could consult records of previous campaigns, previous crises, previous solutions. They could learn from history because history was recorded and preserved. The sea peoples, lacking comparable literary traditions, could not draw on similar resources. The artistic conventions that govern the Medinet Habu reliefs must be understood to interpret them correctly. Egyptian art was not naturalistic in the modern sense. It followed strict conventions designed to convey information clearly and maintain cosmic order. The pharaoh is always shown larger than other figures because he is more important. Enemies are shown in defeat because that is their proper relationship to Egypt. Battles are shown with Egyptian victory certain because that outcome reflects cosmic truth, regardless of the messy reality of actual combat. Understanding these conventions does not make the reliefs less valuable as historical sources. It makes them different kinds of sources, ones that must be read with knowledge of how they were created and what they were meant to communicate. The children born to Sea Peoples settlers in Egyptian service represented a new generation, one that knew only Egypt. They spoke Egyptian, worshipped Egyptian gods, considered themselves Egyptian. Within 2 or 3 generations, the Sea Peoples' origins of these families would be largely forgotten, remembered only in family traditions or place names. This assimilation was typical of how ancient societies absorbed foreign populations. Identity was fluid, determined more by culture and allegiance than by ancestry. The Sea Peoples, who became Egyptian, were no less Egyptian for their origins, just as the Hyksos, who had ruled Egypt centuries earlier, had been fully Egyptian in their royal ideology and administrative practices despite their foreign origins. The economic cost of the Sea Peoples' wars appears indirectly in Egyptian records. Temple donations declined in later years of Ramesses' reign. Building projects slowed. The quality of craftwork in royal tombs decreased. These signs point to economic stress, to resources stretched thin by military expenditures. War is expensive, and even victorious wars drain treasuries. The gold, grain, and manufactured goods used to equip and supply the army at Djahy represented wealth that could not be used for other purposes. The soldiers who fought there were not farming, not building, not producing goods. The horses that pulled chariots required feed and care. The weapons used in battle were expended. Victory preserved Egypt but did not come free. The final years of Ramesses III's reign were troubled. The economic problems persisted. Labour strikes continued. There were conspiracies in the royal court, including an assassination attempt in which the pharaoh may have been wounded, possibly fatally. The details are unclear, preserved only in fragmentary records of legal proceedings against the conspirators. What is clear is that Egypt's internal stability was precarious despite the external victories. The society that had defeated the Sea Peoples was itself under strain, beset by problems that military success could not solve. When Ramesses III died, probably in 1156 or 1155 BC, after a reign of approximately 32 years, he left an ambiguous legacy. He had saved Egypt from the greatest external threat it had faced in generations. He had maintained internal order despite economic difficulties. He had built magnificent temples and monuments. He had been a successful warrior king in the traditional pharaonic mould. Yet Egypt was weaker at his death than at his accession. The empire was smaller, the treasury was depleted, the problems would grow worse under his successors. The Battle of Djahy deserves remembrance not just as Egyptian victory, but as a turning point in history. It marked the moment when the Bronze Age collapse met effective resistance. When displaced populations seeking new homes confronted a power still strong enough to defend itself. When ancient military professionalism defeated desperate courage. The battle shaped the future of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Sea Peoples, defeated by Egypt, could not unify to create a new empire. Instead, they fragmented and settled, becoming local populations, Philistines in Canaan, possibly ancestors of later Mediterranean peoples. Egypt survived but never recovered its former dominance. The balance of power shifted. New kingdoms would arise, new peoples would emerge. The Iron Age was beginning, and Djahy stood at the threshold between the dying Bronze Age world and the future.